The throne room was a cavern of frozen sound. Hundreds of courtiers, draped in silks the color of blood and midnight, stood as still as the gargoyles carved into the obsidian walls, their ancient, unblinking eyes fixed on the human girl who dared to walk the blood marble aisle alone. Yuna felt their stares like 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. Her dress, the simple grey wool of a commoner, was an affront in this sea of opulence. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird caught in the cage of her own body. But for the first time in her life, a force greater than her fear pulled her forward. It was a golden chord, humming with a music only she and the king on his throne could hear, a resonant thrum that had sung in her veins since the moment she'd first laid eyes on him. At the end of the aisle, seated on a throne of polished iron and bone, was Alaric. He was not a king of storybooks. He was a creature of beautiful, terrifying severity. His black hair was a slash of darkness against the pale, perfect planes of his face. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, held a stillness that promised violence. He watched her approach not with curiosity, but with a chilling, analytical patience, as if she were a curious insect scuttling across his floor. The power that rolled off him was a physical weight, pressing down on the air, on her lungs, making it difficult to breathe. Yet the bond, that impossible, undeniable connection, sang louder, a promise of warmth in the face of all that cold. It told her she was home. It told her she was his. She stopped at the foot of the dais, the polished floor reflecting her own terrified face back at her. She sank into a curtsy, her worn leather shoes scraping softly against the stone. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. It was everything. It was the only thing. "My king," she began, her voice a tremor in the vast hall. She forced herself to meet his gaze. The storm in his eyes was distant, unmoved. "I am Yuna. I have come," she swallowed, the words feeling fragile and foolish on her tongue. "I have come because the fates have decreed it. Because my soul recognizes yours." She took a breath, the last breath of the girl she used to be, and spoke the ancient, binding words. "I claim you, Alaric, as my mate." The silence that followed was different. It was not merely quiet, it was a void, a shocked vacuum where sound had ceased to exist. Yuna could feel the ripple of disbelief move through the court, the sharp intake of 100 vampiric breaths. A human. A scarred, common human girl, with a faint limp from a childhood fever and hands calloused from work, was claiming their immortal king. And then, Alaric laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a cold, sharp crack that shattered the silence into a million glittering, cruel pieces. It echoed from the high, vaulted ceilings, a sound of pure, dismissive mockery. He leaned forward on his throne, his chin resting on a fist, and the chilling smile that touched his lips did not reach his eyes. His gaze swept over her, a slow, insulting appraisal that catalogued every flaw, the mended tear in her sleeve, the paleness of her skin, the tremor in her hands. "You claim me," he repeated, his voice a low, silken purr that carried to every corner of the hall. He made the word "you" an insult. A wisp of a thing. A broken toy left too long in the rain. He rose from his throne, a slow, fluid movement of absolute power. He descended the 3 steps of the dais, each footfall a thunderclap in Yuna's ears. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the impossible cold that radiated from his body. He was a mountain of black velvet and unforgiving stone. "Look at you," he whispered, for her alone, yet the intensity of his voice carried. "You are human. Frail. You would shatter with a touch." He gestured vaguely at her left leg, the one that had always been weaker. "Damaged. You offer me weakness. You offer me a liability." He circled her slowly, a predator examining its flawed, uninteresting prey. The court watched, rapt and merciless. "The bond you feel is an error," he declared, his voice rising again to fill the hall. "A cosmic joke. A flaw in the tapestry of fate. It means nothing." He stopped in front of her again, leaning down until his face was level with hers. His beauty was a weapon, sharp and devastating. "I am Alaric. I am the eternal king of this realm. My mate will be a queen of power and substance, a creature of night who can stand beside me for 1,000 years. Not." This the word hung in the air, dripping with contempt. "I reject your claim," he said, and the words were like stones, each one striking her, bruising her. I reject this bond. You are nothing to me. He turned his back on her. The golden cord in her chest didn't just break, it was ripped out, leaving a raw, bleeding wound that gaped open to the cold. The music stopped. The world went silent, save for the blood roaring in her ears and the first, triumphant whispers of the court. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating cloak that stole the air from her lungs. She saw not a single shred of pity in the sea of perfect, predatory faces around her. She saw only satisfaction. The king had put the little human in her place. Yuna stood there for a long moment, frozen in the wreckage of her hope. Her body felt like it was made of glass, and the king's laughter had been the stone that had shattered it completely. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only the gaping, howling void where the bond had been. He had taken even that from her. He had called it an error. A joke. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she turned. She did not run. She walked, each step an agony, back down the long, blood marble aisle. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the great wooden doors at the far end of the hall. She could feel Alaric's cold eyes on her back. She could feel the court's derision. But she would not give them her tears. Not here. The tears could come later, in the dark, when she was alone. The great doors boomed shut behind her, sealing her out, sealing her into a new, unendurable silence. The silence of being utterly, irrevocably alone. The small antechamber she had been given felt more like a cell than a guest room. The stone walls wept with a perpetual dampness, and the single high window showed only a sliver of bruised twilight sky. For hours, Yuna had sat on the edge of the lumpy cot, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The echoes of the throne room still ricocheted inside her skull, the whispers, the cold appraisal in his eyes, and worst of all, his laughter. It was a sound that had flayed her soul raw. A broken toy left too long in the rain. The pain was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws and teeth, tearing at the hollow space where the bond had once sung. It was an amputation. She felt its absence as a phantom limb, a constant, agonizing ache for something that was no longer there. He had not just rejected her, he had invalidated the most profound truth she had ever known. He had looked at the core of her being and declared it worthless. A single, hot tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. Soon, she was choking on silent sobs, her body shaking with the force of her grief. This castle, which for a few hopeful hours had felt like a destination, was now a monument to her shame. Every stone seemed to mock her. Every shadow seemed to hold the glint of contemptuous vampiric eyes. She could not stay here. To remain would be to slowly die of this humiliation, to wither under the constant reminder of what she had lost, of what had been so cruelly denied. Her decision was not a thought but an instinct, the same instinct that tells a wounded animal to crawl away into the shadows to die. She had to leave. She had to put as much distance as possible between herself and this place, between herself and him. Rising on unsteady legs, she moved about the small room. She had brought almost nothing with her. A spare wool tunic, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a small, carved wooden bird her father had made for her years ago. It was the only thing of beauty she owned. She wrapped it carefully in the tunic and tucked it into the small leather satchel she wore at her hip. She drank the last of the water from the pitcher on the rickety table, the coolness a small shock against her feverish skin. There was no plan. There was only the desperate, driving need to be gone. Waiting for true darkness to fall was the hardest part. The sliver of sky in her window faded from purple to indigo to the deep, starless black of a moonless night. The sounds of the castle began to change. The distant murmur of courtiers and servants faded, replaced by the hushed footfalls of the nightly guard and the sighing of the wind through the high battlements. Her heart pounded with a new rhythm now, not of grief, but of fear. She was a nobody. If she was caught, who knew what they would do to her? At best, they would drag her back to this room. At worst, she didn't let her mind go there. She pressed her ear to the heavy wooden door, listening. Silence. Taking a breath that did little to calm her, she lifted the iron latch. It groaned in protest, the sound deafeningly loud in the quiet corridor. She froze, her body rigid, listening for any sign that she had been heard. Nothing. Slipping through the crack, she pulled the door gently closed behind her. The hallway was a river of shadows, broken only by the occasional torch sputtering in an iron sconce, casting long, dancing figures that looked like grasping hands. She kept to the deepest parts of the darkness, her soft shoes making almost no sound on the cold stone flags. Her limp, usually a source of frustration, was a quiet curse now, each uneven step a potential betrayal. She moved with a desperate stealth, her senses stretched taut. The castle was a labyrinth, but she had a good sense of direction. During her hopeful, foolish journey to the throne room, she had noted the way the air changed, the direction of the drafts. The air that smelled of pine and damp earth came from the outer walls, from the direction of freedom. She followed that scent now, a breadcrumb trail leading her away from the opulent, suffocating heart of the fortress. She passed grand archways leading to silent banquet halls and deserted galleries where the portraits of Alaric's ancestors watched her with painted, judgmental eyes. Each one seemed to have his same severe mouth, his same stormy gaze. Generations of pride and power, judging her inadequacy. Her destination was a small postern gate she had noticed near the kitchens on her way in, a servant's entrance meant for disposing of refuse. It was her best chance. The main gates would be heavily guarded, but a small, forgotten door might be overlooked. It took her what felt like an eternity, navigating a maze of service corridors and spiraling stone staircases that seemed designed to confuse. The air grew colder, heavier with the smell of wet stone and decay. Finally, she saw it, a small, arched doorway of weathered wood, bound with rusted iron. Hope, a fragile, fluttering thing, stirred in her chest for the first time since the throne room. She reached for the heavy iron ring that served as a handle, her fingers trembling. This was it. A few more steps and she would be outside the walls, free to disappear into the forest, to walk until her legs gave out, to find some corner of the world where no one knew her name or her shame. She pulled. The door was heavy, swollen with damp, but it moved with a low, groaning complaint. A sliver of night opened up, smelling of rain-soaked leaves and freedom. She slipped through, her small bag catching for a moment on the rough wood. She was out. The cool night air was a balm on her hot face. She was standing in a small, neglected courtyard, the high castle walls looming over her. Beyond a crumbling stone archway lay the dark, welcoming expanse of the royal woods. She took a step, then another, her pace quickening into a stumbling run. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The archway was just ahead. Freedom. Leaving so soon? The voice, smooth as velvet and sharp as glass, stopped her dead. It came from the shadows of the archway, and it was not Alaric's. A figure detached itself from the darkness, stepping into the faint starlight. He was tall and elegant, with hair the color of spun silver that fell across a face almost as beautiful as the king's, but crueler. There was a predatory grace in his movements, a languid confidence that set every nerve in Yuna's body on edge. She recognized him from the court. He had stood near the throne, watching her with an unnerving, speculative intensity. "I am Prince Caspian," he said, his smile a flash of white in the gloom. "The king's younger brother. And you, little bird, are the talk of the castle." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her with the same insulting thoroughness as Alaric's, but with a different kind of hunger. "Trying to fly the coop after my brother clipped your wings? How predictable." Yuna's heart, which had been pounding with the hope of escape, now hammered with a primal, cornered animal fear. She backed away, her hand instinctively going to the small satchel at her side. "I mean no harm. I am just leaving." "Oh, I know you mean no harm," Caspian purred, closing the distance between them with a frightening, silent speed. He was in front of her now, blocking her path to the woods. "But you see, there's a matter of law. An old law, but a potent one. My brother, in his infinite arrogance, has forgotten it. A mate, publicly claimed and publicly rejected, is considered forfeit." He savored the word, letting it hang in the cold air. "The bond is severed from the one who spurned it, but its echo remains. It becomes a prize for any who are bold enough to take it." His meaning was terrifyingly clear. He saw her not as a person, but as an object, a tool to be used against his brother. A way to claim a sliver of the power and destiny that had been denied to him. "Stay away from me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Caspian's smile widened. Why would I do that? Alaric cast you aside. He called you nothing. A broken toy, he echoed the king's words with relish. But one man's trash, he murmured, reaching out and tracing a finger along her jawline, his touch shockingly cold, is another man's treasure. Or, at the very least, a delightful way to enrage a king. Una flinched away from his touch, her revulsion giving her a surge of adrenaline. She tried to dart around him, to make a break for the trees. But he was impossibly fast. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her arm like an iron manacle. His grip was absolute, bruising. Let me go, she cried, struggling against him, but it was like fighting against a statue. Feisty, he chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. I like that. He pulled her closer, his other hand tangling in her hair, forcing her head back. His face loomed over hers, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant, proprietary light. Don't fight it, little bird. This is your destiny now. You will be mine. And through you, I will finally have a hold over my perfect, untouchable brother. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. She thrashed in his grip, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. He simply absorbed the blows, his smile never wavering. He lowered his head, his cold lips brushing against the side of her neck. She could feel the sharp points of his fangs graze her skin. A sob of pure terror escaped her. No, please. He doesn't want you, Caspian whispered against her throat, his voice a venomous comfort. But I do. And then, his fangs sank into her flesh. The pain was a searing, white-hot shock, followed by a dizzying weakness as he began to drink. The world tilted, the stars blurring in her vision. Her struggles weakened, her limbs growing heavy and useless. In the encroaching darkness of her mind, one thought, faint and desperate, cried out. A name. Alaric. It was a prayer to a god who had already forsaken her. The last thing she was aware of was the coppery taste of her own blood in the air and the sound of Caspian's satisfied sigh. Alaric stood before the massive hearth in his private study, a goblet of blood-dark wine swirling in his hand. The fire did nothing to warm the glacial chill that had settled deep in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. He had been trying to lose himself in state ledgers and military reports, the familiar weight of his kingdom a grounding force against the unfamiliar turmoil inside him. But the numbers blurred, the words meaningless. His mind kept replaying the scene in the throne room. The girl. Una. He saw her standing before him, so small and fragile in that great, cavernous space. He saw the defiant hope in her eyes, a hope he had deliberately, methodically extinguished. He heard her trembling voice speak the words of claiming, and he felt again the phantom jolt of the bond, a blinding, terrifying surge of connection that threatened to pull him under. It was a weakness. A fatal flaw in his armor. A human mate, mortal and breakable, would be a vulnerability his enemies would exploit without hesitation. She would be a chain around his neck, a constant source of fear in a life that had been defined by its absence. His laughter had been a shield. His cruelty, a scalpel used to cut the connection before it could fester. I reject you. The words had been necessary. They had been a strategic move to protect his kingdom, to protect himself. So why did they taste like ash in his mouth? Why did the silence in his soul, where her song had briefly been, feel so much like a wound? He threw back the wine, the rich, metallic taste doing nothing to soothe the disquiet. It was done. He had excised the weakness. He would forget her. In a week, she would be a distasteful memory. In a month, she would be nothing. A faint, inexplicable spike of fear, sharp and cold, lanced through him. It was a ghost of an emotion, alien and unwelcome. It felt like her. He scowled, dismissing it. A lingering echo of the severed bond, nothing more. He was the king. His will was absolute. He would not be haunted by a slip of a girl. The heavy oak doors to his study swung open without a knock. Only one person would dare such a thing. Brother, Caspian said, gliding into the room with his usual insufferable grace. He was smiling, a smug, self-satisfied expression that Alaric had loathed for centuries. Brooding in the dark. How very theatrical of you. What do you want, Caspian? Alaric asked, his voice flat. He did not turn from the fire. I merely came to congratulate you, Caspian said, his voice dripping with false sincerity as he moved to stand beside his brother at the hearth. A masterful performance today. The way you crushed that little human's hopes. So decisive. So cruel. Father would have been proud. Alaric's jaw tightened. I did what was necessary. Of course, Caspian murmured, picking up a silver letter opener from the mantelpiece and examining its sharp point. But your decisiveness has created such an interesting opportunity. The old laws are so full of delightful loopholes, aren't they? Alaric turned his head slowly, his storm-grey eyes narrowing. He took in his brother's appearance. Caspian's silver hair was slightly disheveled. His cravat was askew. And there was a faint, dark crimson stain on the pristine white linen, just at the corner of his mouth. Alaric's gaze locked onto it. And then, the scent hit him. It was faint, almost lost beneath the cloying fragrance of Caspian's cologne and the smell of old paper and wood smoke in the room. But it was there. Unmistakable. The scent of sun-warmed herbs and fresh rain that had clung to the human girl. The scent of her blood. It was on his brother's lips. Time seemed to slow, to stretch and thin until it was a single, crystalline moment. The fire in the hearth, the goblet in his hand, the smug look on Caspian's face, it all receded. There was only that scent. Her blood. On his brother. His. The carefully constructed walls of logic and control Alaric had built around himself did not just crack, they vaporized. The rejected bond, the connection he had tried to surgically remove, did not just reawaken. It detonated. It was a white-hot supernova of pure, primal rage. It was not a thought. It was not an emotion. It was a physical transformation, a tidal wave of possessiveness so absolute, so violent, it remade him in an instant. The king vanished. The politician, the strategist, the cold, calculating monarch, they were all burned away. All that remained was the predator. The mate. His hand, which had been holding the wine goblet, clenched. The crystal shattered, shards digging into his palm, but he didn't feel it. Wine and his own dark blood dripped onto the stone floor. He didn't see it. He saw only the stain on Caspian's mouth. What? Alaric said, and his voice was not his own. It was a low, guttural snarl that vibrated from the deepest parts of his chest, a sound that hadn't been heard in that castle for centuries. Have you done? Caspian's smirk faltered, a flicker of genuine alarm appearing in his eyes at the change in his brother. He had expected anger. He had not expected this. This was something ancient and untamed. The law is clear, Alaric. What you cast aside is free for the taking. She is. Caspian never finished the sentence. Alaric moved. He was not fast, he was instantaneous. One moment he was by the fire, the next he was upon his brother, his hand clamped around Caspian's throat, lifting him clear off the floor and slamming him against the stone wall with a force that cracked the mortar. Books and artifacts tumbled from the shelves, crashing to the floor. Mine, Alaric roared, the word a physical blow. His eyes were no longer grey storms, they were black pits of incandescent fury. His fangs, longer and sharper than Caspian had ever seen them, were fully descended. She is mine. You rejected her. Caspian choked out, his hands clawing uselessly at Alaric's unyielding grip. You said she was nothing. I lied, Alaric snarled, and the admission was ripped from him, a confession torn from the heart of his rage. He slammed Caspian against the wall again, harder this time. Where is she? For a moment, Caspian's pride warred with his survival instinct. He saw the truth in Alaric's eyes, there was no reason, no negotiation left in him. Only a singular, murderous intent. The west courtyard, he gasped, the words barely audible. By the postern gate. Alaric held him there for another heartbeat, his knuckles white, the promise of death radiating from him. Then, with a final, contemptuous shove, he threw his brother aside. Caspian crumpled to the floor, landing in a heap amidst the scattered books, gasping for air and clutching his bruised throat. Alaric didn't spare him a second glance. He was already moving, a blur of black velvet and cold fury. He tore the study doors from their hinges as he exited, the sound of splintering would echoing in his wake. He moved through the hallowed halls of his own castle like a storm, a force of nature that had been unleashed. Guards and servants flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with terror as the wave of his incandescent rage washed over them. He didn't see them. He didn't see anything but the path to her. He followed her scent, the faint trail of her fear and her blood, a beacon in the darkness. It led him through the winding service corridors, the same path she had taken in her desperate flight. But where she had moved with stealth, he moved with the force of a battering ram. The world had narrowed to a single, burning point of focus: find her. Protect her. Destroy anything that stood in his way. He burst into the west courtyard just as a cold wind swept through the crumbling archway. He saw her immediately. She was a small, crumpled heap at the base of the wall, a pale ghost in the thin starlight. Her head was lolled to the side, her hair fanned out on the damp flagstones. Still. So terribly still. For a single, heart-stopping second, he thought he was too late. A fear colder and sharper than any rage clawed at his throat, threatening to choke him. He was at her side in an instant, dropping to his knees on the cold, wet stone. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the pulse point on her neck. It was there. Faint, thready, but there. Beating. The relief that washed over him was so profound it was painful, a physical agony that left him breathless. She was alive. He had not lost her. He gently gathered her into his arms, her body limp and fragile as a doll's. The wound on her neck was a dark, ugly marring of her pale skin, a brand of his brother's trespass. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He looked down at her face, so pale in the starlight, her lashes dark smudges against her skin. He saw the tear tracks on her cheeks. He had done this. His pride. His fear. His cruelty had driven her from the castle and into his brother's waiting jaws. The rage he felt for Caspian was a wildfire, but the self-loathing that followed it was a cold, deep ocean. He held her against his chest, her small weight a terrifying, precious burden. The bond, no longer a phantom hum but a roaring, possessive force, screamed at him. Protect. Keep. Hold. He had tried to cut this out of himself, and in doing so, he had almost destroyed her. Never again. He rose to his feet, holding her securely. His gaze swept the courtyard, the forest beyond, his eyes glowing with a faint, dangerous light. Let them come. Let his brother gather his allies. Let the whole world try to take her from him now. He would burn it all to the ground first. His first words to her since his rejection were not an apology, not a comfort. They were a vow, a guttural promise spoken to the night. No one will ever touch you again. He turned and carried her back into the heart of the fortress, no longer a king returning to his castle, but a dragon bringing his treasure back to the hoard. And he would guard it with fire and blood. Yuna awoke to the scent of beeswax and lavender, and the impossible softness of finely woven linen against her skin. For a moment, she was adrift in a sea of confusion, her mind sluggish and thick. The last thing she remembered was the cold stone of the courtyard, the sharp, searing pain in her neck, and Caspian's triumphant eyes. She should be dead. Or worse. She opened her eyes. She was not in her damp, cold cell. She was in a vast, opulent bedchamber, larger than any room she had ever been in. A fire crackled merrily in a marble fireplace across the room, casting a warm, flickering glow on walls hung with rich tapestries. The bed she lay in was a mountain of feather pillows and silk-stuffed duvets, the four posts carved into the shape of sleeping dragons. This was a king's room. His room. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She sat up abruptly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Her hand flew to her neck. The skin was tender, but the wound was gone. Healed. She looked down at herself. She was no longer in her own simple wool dress. She was wearing a fine, cream-colored nightgown of lawn cotton, so soft it felt like a cloud. Someone had undressed her, cared for her. The intimacy of the thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine. You are awake. The voice came from the shadows near the hearth. Alaric stepped into the firelight, and the breath caught in Yuna's throat. He was not the cold, mocking king from the throne room. This was a different creature entirely. He was dressed simply, in a black tunic and trousers, no crown, no regal finery. But the power radiating from him was more potent, more primal than it had been before. His stormy eyes were fixed on her, and they held an intensity that was terrifying. It was not scorn. It was something darker, hotter. It was possession. She scrambled backwards in the bed, pulling the duvet up to her chin like a shield. "What am I doing here? Where is Caspian?" "Gone," Alaric said, his voice a low rumble. "He will not trouble you again." The finality in his tone left no room for doubt. He took a step closer to the bed. Una flinched. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He looked, for the first time, uncertain. It was a crack in his armor of absolute control. "You are safe here." "Safe," she echoed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, bitter anger. "You call this safe? I am your prisoner." "You are my guest," he corrected, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "A guest who is not allowed to leave," she shot back, gesturing around the magnificent room. "This is a beautiful cage, but it is still a cage." A muscle worked in his jaw. He knew she was right. Since bringing her here, he had posted his most loyal royal guard at her door with explicit orders that she was not to leave, and no one was to enter without his permission. He had been a whirlwind of activity, his rage channeling itself into cold, swift action. He had sent riders to his loyal vassals, declared his brother a traitor to the crown, and placed the castle on a war footing. The whispers had already started. The court was dividing. Many of the older, more traditional houses saw his actions as tyrannical. He had publicly rejected the mate, nullifying the bond. By their laws, Caspian's actions, while distasteful, had been within his rights. Alaric's violent response was seen as the act of a despot, not a wronged mate. Civil war was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability, brewing in the shadowed halls of his own kingdom. And at the center of it all was this small, fragile human, looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. He had done this to her. He had humiliated her, driven her away, and now he had trapped her. He didn't know how to fix it. The language of apology, of tenderness, was foreign to him. He only knew the language of power, of action. And so, he had built a fortress around her. "It is for your protection," he said, the words stiff and inadequate. "My protection?" Her laugh was a brittle, broken sound. "From whom? Your brother, whom you drove me to? Or from the court that you taught to despise me? You are the one who told them I was nothing. You held me up for ridicule, and now you wonder why I am in danger." Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, and they all found their mark. He had no defense against her truth. He could face down armies, he could quell rebellions, but he could not withstand the accusation in her eyes. He looked away from her, his gaze falling to the fire. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him more than he could ever explain. The words felt like pulling teeth. Una stared at him, her anger faltering in the face of her shock. It was the last thing she had expected to hear. But the quiet admission did little to soothe the raw wound of her humiliation. "Wrong," she whispered. "You destroyed me. In front of everyone. You took the most sacred thing I have ever felt and you ground it into dust with your laughter. And now you say you were wrong." He turned back to her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a king, not a predator, but a man drowning in a storm of his own making. There was a raw, desperate turmoil in his eyes. "I cannot explain," he said, his voice rough. "Not yet. But I will not let anyone harm you. You will stay here, where I can ensure that." His protection felt suffocating, a blanket of possession that threatened to smother what little was left of her. She was a pawn in a game between two princes, a prize to be fought over. Her own feelings, her own pain, seemed to be an irrelevant footnote in their epic struggle. She clutched the duvet tighter, the soft fabric a poor defense against the turmoil he brought into the room. He was a walking storm, and he had dragged her into its eye. 4 days, that was their reality. Una was confined to the royal wing, a suite of rooms so luxurious they made her ache for the simplicity of her old life. Food was brought on silver trays, gowns of silk and velvet appeared in the wardrobe, books bound in fine leather were stacked by the fireplace. It was all a beautiful, silent apology, and she hated it. She hated the feeling of being kept, of being an object so precious it had to be locked away. Alaric was a constant, circling presence. He would appear at odd hours, standing in the doorway, just watching her with that same burning intensity. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was to ask if she needed anything. He never touched her. The space between them crackled with unspoken things, with the violent memory of her rejection and the equally violent reality of his newfound possession. From her window, she could see the courtyard below, bustling with a new, grim purpose. Men-at-arms drilled with pikes and swords. Lords with grim faces and banners she didn't recognize rode in and out of the castle gates. The kingdom was arming itself. A war was coming. And she, Una, the broken toy, was the cause of it all. The weight of that knowledge was a heavier burden than any cage. She was no longer just shamed, she was a catalyst for destruction, a curse upon the land she had hoped to call home. The first battle was a distant rumor, a story brought to her by a nervous serving girl who was one of the few people Alaric allowed to attend her. A skirmish at the northern pass. Lord Valerus, one of Caspian's key allies, had tried to seize the crossing and block reinforcements loyal to the king. The girl spoke in hushed, awed tones of Alaric's fury. He had ridden out himself, at the head of his royal guard. They said he fought not like a king directing his forces, but like a demon unleashed. He had carved a path directly to Lord Valerus, and the battle had ended when the king had returned with Valerus's head. Una felt sick. Men were dying. A noble lord was dead. All because of her. Because a king could not admit his feelings, and his brother could not stomach his pride. She went to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The war was no longer an abstraction. It had a face. A name. A body count. Later that night, Alaric came to her. He didn't stop in the doorway this time but walked fully into the room. He was still wearing his blackened steel armor, though he had removed his helm. It was spattered with mud and something darker. His face was grim, etched with exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline of battle. He looked at her, and the raw need in his eyes was so profound it made her take an involuntary step back. "It has begun," he said, his voice flat and weary. "I heard," she whispered. "You killed Lord Valerus." He gave a sharp, humorless nod. "He sided with my brother. He would have seen you claimed and collared like a pet. He paid the price for his treason." The coldness of his words, the justification of such brutality, chilled her to the bone. "Is that what this is about?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of its old fire. "Proving who has the right to collar me? Am I just a prize to be won in your war?" The accusation struck him. He strode across the room, stopping just before her. The smell of cold steel, leather, and dried blood clung to him. "You are not a prize," he growled, his control fraying. "You are everything." The words were a raw admission, torn from a place he kept locked and guarded. "Do you think I am doing this for a throne? I already have a throne. I am doing this because the thought of him, of anyone, laying a hand on you makes me want to tear the world apart." His passion was a terrifying force, a wildfire that threatened to consume her. It was too much, too soon. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. "You rejected me," she said, the words a weary refrain, the central, unmovable fact of her existence. "You told the whole world I was worthless. You cannot undo that with violence. You cannot kill enough people to make me forget what you said." She felt him behind her, his presence a suffocating weight. She could feel the heat of his body, the struggle raging within him. She expected him to shout, to command, to force her to understand. Instead, there was only silence. A long, heavy silence filled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. "I know," he said at last, and his voice was so quiet, so full of a pain that mirrored her own, that she almost didn't recognize it. "I know." He left without another word, the sound of his armored boots receding down the stone corridor. Una sank onto the window seat, her legs suddenly weak. He was a monster. A killer. A tyrant who was plunging his kingdom into war for a whim. But in that one, quiet moment, she had heard something else in his voice. Not just possession. Not just rage. It was a sound she knew intimately. It was the sound of regret. And that small, terrifying flicker of shared humanity was more dangerous to her than all his fury. It was the first hint that the man who had humiliated her and the man who was now destroying his kingdom for her were not two different people, but two sides of the same, deeply fractured soul. And it was the first time she allowed herself to wonder, not what he had done, but why. The war ground on, a slow, brutal siege not just of castles, but of loyalties. Each day brought news of another house declaring for Caspian, another skirmish along a river crossing, another village burned. The castle became a fortress in truth, the mood grim and tense. Yuna watched it all from her gilded cage, a helpless spectator to the destruction being wrought in her name. The weight of it settled on her, a constant, dull ache of guilt. She stopped eating, picking at the lavish meals sent to her rooms. Sleep offered little escape, filled with dreams of fire and clashing steel. She and Alaric existed in a state of fragile truce. He continued his silent vigils, his presence a constant, brooding storm just outside her door or across her room. He brought her things, a rare, winter-blooming flower he'd found in the castle glasshouse, a book of maps detailing lands she would never see, a soft fur blanket for the increasingly cold nights. They were clumsy, silent offerings, attempts to speak a language he did not know. She accepted them with a quiet, sad courtesy that was its own form of armor. She would not give him anger anymore, but she would not give him forgiveness either. She held herself apart, a small, still island in the torrent of his violent emotion. One evening, he came to her later than usual. A cold, driving rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the battlements like a grieving animal. He was not in armor, but his tunic was torn at the shoulder, and a deep, ugly gash ran along his forearm, sluggishly weeping dark, thick blood. He was pale, a stark, alarming contrast to the usual immortal vigor that clung to him. He swayed slightly as he entered the room, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. "You're hurt," she said, the words escaping her before she could stop them. Concern, unwelcome and instinctive, pricked at her. "It is nothing," he bit out, waving a dismissive hand as he walked towards the decanter of wine on a side table. "A blade laced with dead man's blood. It slows the healing," that is all. He poured a goblet with an unsteady hand, his fingers trembling slightly. She watched him, her heart doing a strange, painful flutter in her chest. For all his power, for all his terrifying strength, he was not invincible. He was fighting, bleeding, for her. The thought was both terrifying and profoundly moving. Against every instinct that told her to keep her distance, to protect the fragile walls she had built around her heart, she moved. She went to a chest where the servants kept fresh linens and medicines. She pulled out a clean strip of linen, a bowl, and a small jar of salve that smelled of herbs. She filled the bowl with warm water from a pitcher by the fire and approached him, her heart hammering. He watched her come, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion, like a wolf unused to a gentle hand. He stood rigid as she gently took the wine goblet from his grasp and set it aside. "Sit," she commanded softly. To her astonishment, he did. He sank into one of the heavy chairs by the fire, his gaze never leaving her face. He watched her as if she were performing some strange and magical ritual. She knelt before him, dipping the cloth into the warm water. Her touch was hesitant at first as she began to clean the wound. His skin was cold, like marble, but his blood was hot against her fingers. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but did not pull away. They were silent. The only sounds were the howling wind, the crackling fire, and the soft splash of water as she cleaned the gash. The wound was deep, jagged and angry. She worked with a quiet focus, her movements gentle and sure. It was a simple, intimate act, and in the small space between them, the war, the court, and the bitter memory of her rejection seemed to fade away. There was only this, her touch, his wound. When the cut was clean, she opened the jar of salve. The scent of it filled the air. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. The raw vulnerability in his face stole her breath. The king was gone. The warrior was gone. In his place was only a man, wounded and weary, staring at her with a desperate, aching hunger that had nothing to do with blood. It was a hunger to be seen. To be understood. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. "Why are you doing this?" I don't understand. You said I was weak. A liability. Why burn your kingdom for a liability? His gaze fell to her hands, which were now gently applying the balm to his arm. He watched her fingers, so small and human against his immortal skin. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. Because I was afraid, he said, the words so low she almost didn't hear them. It was a confession of the highest treason for a king like him, an admission of the one thing he was never allowed to be. Afraid of what? She pressed, her voice still a whisper. He finally met her eyes again, and the truth was there, stark and agonizing. Of you, he said. Of what you made me feel. The moment you walked into that throne room, it was like the sun had come indoors. It was overwhelming. He struggled for the words, his brows furrowed in frustration. All my life, I have cultivated control. It is my armor. It is my weapon. It is how I have kept this kingdom safe for 500 years. And you, with a single look, you threatened to undo it all. The bond, it was not a quiet hum for me, Yuna. It was a tidal wave. It wanted to drown me. It wanted to pull me under and remake me into something else. Something that would kneel. Something that would burn for you. He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh. A human. A mortal woman who could be killed by a fall, a fever, a stray arrow. To feel that terrifying, all-consuming need to protect you, to cherish you, it was a weakness I could not afford. It would have made me vulnerable. My enemies would have seen it. They would have used you to break me. He looked at the half-healed wound on his arm. And I would have let them. I would have traded my entire kingdom for your safety. To be ruled by such a feeling, it felt like madness. He finally gave voice to his deepest fear. So I tried to kill it, he whispered, his voice raw. I tried to cut you out of me. I thought my cruelty would be a shield. I thought if I made the world see you as worthless, my heart would believe the lie. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. But it didn't work. It only made the silence louder. And when I smelled your blood on him, I realized that I had not been protecting my kingdom from a weakness. I had been trying to protect myself from my own heart. And in doing so, I almost lost you. He reached out, his uninjured hand hovering for a moment before his fingers gently, tentatively, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of pure connection. I would rather fight 1,000 wars than live in that silence again. Yuna stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't an apology. It was something more. It was a confession. A baring of his soul. His rejection hadn't been about her inadequacy at all. It had been about his terror in the face of a love so powerful it threatened to unmake his entire world. The pride, the cruelty, the cold dismissal, it had all been a desperate act of self-preservation. He had not been pushing her away because he felt nothing, he had been pushing her away because he felt everything. She finished wrapping his arm in the clean linen, her fingers brushing against his. She did not pull away. He did not pull away. They simply stayed there, kneeling and sitting in the warm glow of the firelight, the storm raging outside and a fragile, tentative peace beginning to dawn within. For the first time, she saw the man behind the monster, the terrified heart inside the immortal king. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, the long, cold winter of her own heart began to thaw. The quiet intimacy of that night shifted the world between them. The space was no longer charged with anger and fear, but with a fragile, unspoken understanding. Alaric's presence was no longer a threat, but a constant, grounding weight. He still watched her, but his gaze was different now, less possessive, more questioning. It asked for a forgiveness he still did not know how to request. Yuna, in turn, began to see past the king who had wounded her to the man who was bleeding for her. The war still raged beyond the castle walls, a grim testament to his fear and his fury, but within her rooms, a different, quieter battle was being waged, the battle for trust. Caspian, however, was growing desperate. His rebellion, which had begun with the high-minded appeal to law and tradition, was faltering. Alaric's singular, brutal focus was winning the war through sheer force of will. The rebel lords were losing faith, their resources dwindling. Caspian knew his only remaining gambit was the one that had started it all, Yuna. If he could take her, He could break Alaric's morale and force a surrender. He was no longer fighting for a principle. He was a cornered animal, ready to do anything to survive. He used the network of secret passages that riddled the ancient castle, passages known only to the royal bloodline. While Alaric was miles away, quashing the last major pocket of resistance in the south, Caspian slipped through the walls like a ghost. Una was reading by the fire, the fur blanket Alaric had given her draped over her lap, when a section of the stone wall beside the hearth ground open. She jumped to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat as Caspian stepped out of the darkness. He looked feral. His fine clothes were stained and torn, his silver hair was matted with dirt, and a desperate, feverish light burned in his eyes. "So this is the Queen's new cage," he sneered, his gaze sweeping the luxurious room. "He's keeping you well. A prized pet." "Get out," Una said, her voice shaking but firm. She backed away, putting the heavy oak table between them. Her eyes darted towards the door, but she knew the guards outside would be no match for him. "Oh, I'm not leaving without you," he said, stalking around the table, his movements lithe and predatory. "This all ends now. You are coming with me. When he sees you in my power, he will break. He will have to. He will kill you," she warned, her mind racing, searching for an escape, a weapon. "Perhaps," Caspian conceded with a wild grin. "But he will have lost. That will be enough." He lunged. Una threw a heavy silver candlestick at him. He battered it aside with contemptuous ease and seized her, his hand clamping over her mouth before she could scream. He was all wiry, desperate strength, dragging her back towards the secret passage. She fought, kicking and struggling, but it was useless. He was too strong. He was pulling her into the suffocating darkness of the passage when the main doors to the chamber exploded inward, blasted into splinters and dust. Alaric stood there, framed in the ruined doorway. He was caked in mud and blood from his journey, his breathing ragged from his frantic, non-stop ride back to the castle. He had felt it, a sudden, piercing spike of her terror through the bond, a silent scream that had sent him racing back, leaving his army behind. His eyes, burning with a black, apocalyptic rage, locked onto Caspian's hand on Una's mouth. "Take your hand off her," Alaric said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. Caspian froze, his escape cut off. He shoved Una in front of him, holding a dagger to her throat. "Stay back, brother," he hissed. "Or she dies. I swear it." Alaric took a single, deliberate step into the room. "You will not harm her." It was not a plea. It was a statement of absolute fact. "You don't know what I'll do." Caspian's voice was high with panic. "You broke the law. You chose this human over your own blood, over your own kingdom. I chose my heart over my pride," Alaric corrected, his voice resonating with a power that made the very stones seem to vibrate. "A lesson you have yet to learn." He took another step. He wasn't looking at the knife. He was looking only at Una, his gaze a silent promise. "I am here. I will not let you fall." In that moment, seeing the unwavering strength in his eyes, Una knew what she had to do. She was not a prize. She was not a victim. She drove her elbow back, hard, into Caspian's ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She ducked down and away, scrambling clear of him. Caspian, his human shield gone, let out a roar of fury and charged at Alaric. The fight was not a duel, it was an execution. Alaric met his charge with immovable force. There was the sharp crack of breaking bone, a strangled cry of pain from Caspian, and then silence. Alaric stood over his brother, who lay crumpled on the floor, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Alaric's sword was at his throat. "Finish it," Caspian spat, his eyes filled with hate. Alaric looked down at his brother, at the pathetic, bitter end of their long rivalry. He looked at Una, who was watching him, her face pale but her eyes steady. He saw the war, the destruction, the pain, all of it born from this single, festering jealousy. But he also saw a flicker of the brother he had once known, centuries ago. Killing him now would be an act of rage, not justice. He withdrew his sword. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "You will live with your failure. You are stripped of your name and title. You are banished from these lands. If you ever return, you will be executed on sight." He turned his back on his defeated brother, a final, dismissive act. Royal guards, alerted by the commotion, poured into the room and dragged the disgraced prince away. The civil war was over. In the sudden, ringing silence, Alaric turned to Una. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms, holding her with a desperate, trembling strength, burying his face in her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her shoulder, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him just as tightly. "You came back," she whispered. "It was everything." Days later, the throne room was filled once more. The surviving lords of the realm, both his allies and the newly pardoned rebels, were assembled. The mood was somber, uncertain. They were waiting to see what kind of king they would have now, the cold tyrant or the avenging demon. Alaric entered, not in armor, but in the formal black robes of his office. But he was not alone. He walked hand in hand with Una. She wore a simple gown of deep blue velvet, her head held high. A quiet gasp rippled through the court. They stopped at the foot of the dais, the same spot where she had made her claim, the same spot where he had shattered her world. He did not ascend the throne. He turned to face his people, his hand still holding hers. "I called you here to witness the end of a war," he began, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the cavernous hall. "And the beginning of a new peace. A peace I am solely to blame for breaking." Another murmur of shock. "A king did not admit fault. I stood in this spot and, out of pride and fear, I rejected the greatest gift this world has ever offered me." His gaze fell to Una, and his voice softened, filled with a tenderness that stunned the court into silence. "I told you she was a weakness. I was wrong. Her heart is stronger than any army. Her courage is truer than any law. My fear of loving her was the only weakness. My rejection of her was the only treason." He let go of her hand, and to the utter astonishment of every vampire present, Alaric, their ancient and powerful king, knelt. He went down on one knee before the human girl, bowing his head. "Una," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before my people, and before my own heart, I undo my great wrong. I do not claim you. I ask you, will you be my mate? Will you be my queen?" Tears streamed down Una's face, but they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She looked down at this impossible, terrible, beautiful man, and she saw her home. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked. "Yes, Alaric." He rose, his face transformed by a radiant smile that washed away all the severity, leaving only a breathtaking love. He took her hand and slid a simple, elegant ring of silver and sapphire onto her finger. He then led her up the steps of the dais. He did not take the throne for himself. He guided her to it, and she sat a day. He remained standing beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a king standing guard for his queen. "Behold your queen," he declared to the silent hall. "Una, the wise. Una, the brave. My heart, and the heart of this kingdom." The rebuilding was slow. The scars of the war ran deep, both on the land and in the hearts of its people. But the foundation they built upon was stronger than before. It was a foundation of truth. Alaric ruled, but now, he listened. He sought Una's counsel in all things. Her human perspective, her compassion, and her innate understanding of the common folk tempered his immortal severity. She taught him mercy, he taught her strength. They rebuilt trust in the quiet moments. In late-night conversations by the fire, where he would tell her stories of his long, lonely life, and she would tell him of her simple, quiet one. They rebuilt it in the shared work of governance, in the way he would defer to her judgment in court, showing his people that her voice was equal to his own. They rebuilt it in touch, the casual brush of his hand against hers, the way he would tuck a blanket around her as she slept, the way she would place a calming hand on his arm when the burdens of kingship weighed on him. One evening, months later, they stood on the high balcony of her bedchamber, looking out over the capital city. The lights twinkled below, a sea of peaceful stars. The sounds of life, music, laughter, conversation, drifted up on the cool night air. The city was healing. The kingdom was healing. Alaric came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they watched the city together in a comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Coming here?" She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand covering his where they were clasped at her waist. She thought of the girl who had walked that aisle, so full of terrified hope. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, the fear. And she thought of this. This quiet peace. This profound, unshakable sense of belonging. "No," she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain strength. "It was the only path that could have led me home." He tightened his arms around her, his heart, which had been still for 1,000 years, beating a slow, steady rhythm against her back. The bond between them was no longer a terrifying tidal wave or a phantom ache. It was a deep, calm, and endless ocean. They had survived the storm, and in the